Steven, tell me, what is actually environmental humanities?
Yeah, the environmental humanities comes, in one sense, from a longer tradition of environmental disciplinary approaches to scholarship that have a longer history going back at least 50 years, longer really, if you think about archaeology and anthropology. But with the rise, I think especially in the 1970s, say, of environmental history, a couple decades later with the rise of eco-criticism or literature and environment studies, we began to see a serious engagement from sort of centrist humanities disciplines in environmental questions. And I think the environmental humanities is an outgrowth of that. I don't think of it as necessarily synonymous with each of these different disciplinary traditions. It's something newer. We've really only heard people talk about the environmental humanities for the last, somewhere between the last 5 and 10 years. And one of the things that sets it apart, I think, from these earlier traditions of environmental scholarship in the humanities is the degree, I think, of interdisciplinarity.
So do you see it more as a new way of seeing the kind of regular or normal or traditional subjects of the humanities, or do you see it more as a kind of, in a sense, a reaction to the challenges, environmental challenges of today, or are these simply mixed?
Yeah, I do see it as a reaction or a response to environmental challenges, and whether we want to call that an environmental crisis or just a greater awareness of the interrelation of society and humanity with nature and the environment. It's definitely informed by a growing awareness about human-natural relations. And I think it's also informed by different efforts to raise questions about the ethics of human activity in nature. It's definitely part of that. I don't think of it necessarily as a new kind of humanities. I see it as the core humanities mission that we're now beginning to apply to questions about the environment, increasingly as informed by other humanities discourses, but also as informed by science.
So you teach in Mittuniversitetet in Sweden. To what extent has the environmental humanities and that kind of approach changed the ways in which you teach humanities and research humanities in that particular environment?
Yeah, well, it's beginning, so it's early days for us with an environmental humanities approach there. The rector supported an initiative a couple of years ago to begin a more interdisciplinary profile area in the environmental humanities, which we call the Eco-Humanities Hub. And this brought together different subjects, different disciplines within the humanities environment, including literature, including history, including my subject, which is English literature, and other modern languages and religion. And we've now been trying to find ways to move towards greater multidisciplinary engagement and interdisciplinary engagement. But that's a process. It takes time to build up. I think we've also been exploring quite actively how what the questions we are dealing with can have fruitful intersection with questions going on in social sciences, in geography and human geography, in risk and crisis studies, and in sociology. So we haven't drawn, or we're not trying to draw an artificial line, say, between the humanities and the social sciences, or even between the humanities and the environmental sciences. We realize there are different traditions, there are different epistemologies sometimes, but we feel that we have much more in common than what separates us. And so we've been trying to explore more actively how we can actually enrich scholarship, enrich research by crossing that divide.
So you have been very active in organizing a kind of Nordic studies in environmental humanities, and also the kind of relations with the United States and other regions, communities. Is there any particular Nordic approach in this sense, or are we simply a part of the kind of wider global awareness of these kind of environmental questions in the humanities research?
Yeah, I think we're definitely a part of it. I do think, though, that it has come to be seen in the Nordic countries as we've come to be seen as an area that is in sort of the frontier of a certain kind of environmental humanities, which I like to call integrated environmental humanities, where in fact a lot of the questions that we address, a lot of the research arises from specific problems, specific questions, and where the responses to these questions involves bringing different areas of expertise in that you need to answer these questions. So the environmental crisis, or let's say if you want to think about the current situation with climate change, it's far too big, it's far too complex an issue to be really dealt with adequately within the boundaries of single disciplines. We really need different kinds of expertise to come to bear on these questions because they're full of wicked problems. Yeah. And so I think that this is the approach that sets a lot of the Nordic environmental humanities apart from maybe our counterparts in North America and in other geographical contexts around the world. And I think that's one of the approaches that Nordic environmental humanities has come to be known for more and more. Yeah.
So, I mean, all these kind of environmental questions, the kind of applications of our research is very political. I mean, it's, in a sense, I mean, it needs a political will in order to change our behavior in this quest. So how do you see our role in that kind of dialogue with authorities, the people, decision makers, both in international and national arenas?
It's interesting, you know, because one talks about sometimes the policy science interface, and that extends over certain knowledge domains, certainly technical disciplines, natural sciences. If you think about instruments and such as the IPCC, and you think about other sort of policy advisory and assessment, scientific assessment initiatives internationally, often UN-driven, they're very heavily engaging the natural sciences. To a much smaller extent, they engage some social sciences. There's virtual, very little history of engaging the humanities in these. And I think that there's a big risk involved in that. Because humanities scholars, humanities institutions have a lot of knowledge that can be brought to bear on the human dimensions of environmental questions. And so when we think about the currency of a concept such as, you know, Crutzen-Sturmer's the Anthropocene, the age of the human and the effect of the human and the great acceleration, let's say, since the Second World War, and the currency of this idea and how it's really taken off and affected how we think about the effects of human activity in the biosphere, it seems to me somehow bizarre that we wouldn't turn to those people whose professional life is devoted to understanding the human.
I mean, to me, I mean, this is maybe most obvious in many of the European projects that are being funded by funding agencies like Horizon 2020. It's usually the kind of human elements, humanities element in these kind of project descriptions are very often the kind of outlier there. And that kind of integrated approach because seem to be often to be lacking. And do you see any movement in that area, or is
I definitely do.
Yeah.
I definitely do. There are really hopeful signs. I think we're still at the beginning of that curve, though. One of the signs is the Humanities for the Environment initiative, which was funded by the Mellon Foundation a couple of years ago, that started 3 regional observatories around the world. One at Trinity College Dublin for Europe, one in Sydney for Australia, and one in Arizona. at Arizona State University for North America. And after the initial funding period, which has been devoted to trying to build capacity and connect up distinct areas, regions around the world in a common humanities for the environment project, this integrated approach is at the heart, certainly, of what the European Observatory has been doing, because I've been involved in that, and my network, NICE, has been involved in that. And there are very promising signs, because now those 3 observatories are expanding into 5, bringing on an African observatory and an Asian observatory into the mix, and this work is going forward. And I think that one of the ambitions, of course, both of that and of other similar initiatives that we're beginning to see take off in different regional contexts, is to actually have a more felt presence in the scientific advisory and assessment work and in the policy interface coming from the humanities as well.
How are these projects funded? I mean, are there kind of public funding, or are they funded through research grants, or?
It's a combination.
Yeah,
it's a combination of institutional initiatives. For instance, one of the biggest initiatives that I know of recently was when the research foundation Formus, or the research financing agency Formus in Sweden, came together with the research financing foundation Mistra, the Strategic Environmental Research Foundation, and actually put 40 million kroner into the establishment of a new environmental humanities national and international program based in Sweden. And there was a competition for that, and it was fiercely fought after from different constellations within Sweden. And the university that won that was Linköping University. And they started what they call the Seed Box, which is not strictly an institutional endeavor only for Linköping University, but connects actually 5 other universities in Sweden to it, as well as 6 universities internationally. And so this is being financed partly through public funds, through research financing, through government agencies and research foundations, but also partly through co-financing of the institutions that are involved in this consortium. And I see this is a model, I think, increasingly we're beginning to see that, there isn't a single source, but there are many different sources, and these are often coming together in different ways.
Yeah, and creating synergies that
yes.
can. Well, now you're in Iceland. This is not your first time in Iceland, I've heard. So what brings you to this part of the world? How have your connections with Iceland been in the past and hopefully in the future?
Yeah, well, my first connection with Iceland really came back in 2011, shortly after my network, which is the Nordic Network for Interdisciplinary Environmental Studies, began as a de facto environmental humanities network. It was environmental historians, it was eco-critics primarily. Yeah. And we had an ambition, the 10 of us who formed this network to begin with, we had an ambition to connect with other disciplines and with environmentally oriented researchers in other disciplines who were interested in similar questions to us. And so the network expanded from a very small group in Norway, Sweden, and Denmark, with about a dozen people, really to a network much larger that involved Finland and Iceland as well. And the Icelandic National Group joined our network in 2011. The coordinator for that network is Þorvardur Arnarsson, who's right here at the University of Iceland and at the Regional Research Center in Hornafjörður. And on the basis of that, we began to have much more significant interaction with Icelandic colleagues. And out of that grew a couple of projects that are now active, that are part of this integrated approach, where we have environmental historians, where we have literary scholars, where we have geographers, anthropologists, archaeologists, from Sweden, from the Nordic, from Scandinavia, from Iceland, from Greenland, from North America and the UK working together. And much of the work that we're doing actually has an Icelandic focus and has a historical environmental change focus going back really to the founding of Iceland.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating aspect of the study, because because Iceland is of course a kind of environmental laboratory and has been for quite a long time, and this kind of struggle between man and nature has formed Icelandic history to such a great extent.
Absolutely.
So it is, I think, both that can be a kind of contribution to that kind of research. So you are working on further cooperation in this field?
Yeah, absolutely. So that's one of the projects that we have going, and that project is called the Inscribing Environmental Memory Project. And it's actually part of the Integrated History and Future of People on Earth, which is a larger international project, which is part of the new Future Earth Global Sustainability Initiative. And so that project is actually, I would say, a congeries or a constellation of different standalone projects. So the IEM, or the Inscribing Environmental Memory Project, has several different projects that feed into it, and a lot of the people who are doing the research are involved in different standalone projects. But we meet regularly, we have met regularly over the last few years, and we've begun now to produce new outputs, working in ways that I think I, as a humanities scholar, was not used to working in before. So I can give you one example, a recent paper that has now gone into a journal, Global and Planetary Change, looking at historical environmental change in Iceland, where we have 5 co-authors, 2 archaeologists, 1 literary scholar, 1 climate historian, and 1 geoscience specialist, really looking at environmental change in Iceland, and especially how we see that marked in different textual sources, as well as other data that come more from the geosciences area, and where we're trying to now take a closer comparative look at how these different indicators match up with one another. So this is something I'm not used to, and I think a lot of humanities scholars coming out of literary studies, you usually don't co-write authors with 5 or 6 people, or papers with 5 or 6 people, and you almost never write them with people from 4 or 5 different fields, but that's what we're trying now, and it's quite exciting.
Yeah. So this research is really then both on the cutting edge of science, but also in the cutting edge of scientific, how scientists work. So.
Yeah, we certainly hope it is, and I think the initial indications are good. I mean, I think we're being received well. There are obstacles. There are no go-to journals for a scientific paper that's written by an anthropologist, a historian, a literary scholar, a geographer.
It'd be interesting to find reviewers, I guess.
Yeah. So, we're having to get creative about how we disseminate this, because we want to connect with many audiences, but they're not currently collected in a particular journal audience. So it's one of the challenges to the kind of work that we're doing, but we feel it has real beneficial aspects to it, and we feel it's worth the effort.
It's been really interesting speaking to you, and I hope that you will find ways of kind of continue to develop that kind of approach, because it is both crucial for the development of the humanities as a scientific endeavor, but also for our continued existence on this planet, which I think, as a historian, I would hope that would continue into the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.